Turkey's foreign policy priority, the way that I see it, is to transform the country into a pivotal state with a growing regional imprint, a growing regional footprint, which in time will also help Turkey to establish better relations with its partners in the West. The reason why there has been this shift in Turkish strategic thinking has also to do with the fact that the relationship with Europe went sour. Given that the priority in Turkish foreign policy for a long number of years has been to transform Turkey and to achieve EU membership. But we have seen, especially during this decade, that a number of structural problems, like the intractability of the problem in Cyprus, the nasty politicization of the Turkish membership issue in a number of European countries, have combined to drastically alter the perception that Turks have about this relationship. So today there are very few Turks that actually believe that Turkish membership will happen, and therefore there has been a shift of direction, a shift of attention towards the other relationships that Turkey may entertain, and we are now seeing a refocusing of Turkish foreign policy on relationship with southern neighbors, with Middle East and the wider Middle East. But all in all, the objective is to transform Turkey into a pivotal state, which in due time might also help Turkey's aspirations to become a full EU member. Turkey's economic performance influences the conduct of foreign policy in many ways. And actually, I have argued that this is one of the main drivers of the transformation of Turkish foreign policy. Because for a very long number of years, foreign policy in Turkey was construed as an element to ensure the territorial integrity, the hardcore security of the country. So it was essentially security concerns that shaped the agenda of foreign policy. Now, since the early part of this decade, with the economic transformation that has taken place, and that's quite a radical, sharp economic transformation, where we have seen per capita incomes jumping from $3,000 per capita to $9,000 per capita, so a threefold increase within not even a decade. Foreign direct investment inflows jumping from about 1 billion a year to 20 billion a year, and a growing trade volume which has now surpassed the 200 billion mark. That has totally transformed the foreign policy outlook as well. So now one of the objectives of Turkish foreign policy is to ensure that Turkish exporters get new export markets, that the country gets more foreign direct investment, and therefore this economic aspirations shape very much Turkish foreign policy, especially with regard to the neighborhood. So this is definitely one of the components of Turkish foreign policy in relation to its own neighborhood, and in particular towards the Middle East, which it sees as a new untapped market for its economic actors. Well, the Turkish domestic politics actually have a big bearing on how the foreign policy evolves, in the sense that, of course, foreign policy, as in many democratic countries, is an agenda at election time. So there's quite a lively debate about where the foreign policy is going, what the options are. But perhaps even the more important issue is that domestically Turkey has become very polarized between the pro-government and the anti-government camp. And that has a reflection on the debate on foreign policy and the implementation of foreign policy. So when the government wants to basically implement a new course of action that is hotly debated in the country, and sometimes it is being sacrificed for the in terms of the foreign policy objective to the domestic debate. There's this difference between the government, the pro-government side, and the anti-government in many policy areas, including foreign policy. This polarization makes the setting up, the establishment of a consensus around the policy objectives much more difficult, and therefore it makes it puts the sustainability of that foreign policy in question, and it really jeopardizes the long-run sustainability of these foreign policy actions and objectives. Turkey's power is on the rise. There are a number of reasons for that. One is essentially the economic transformation of the country that allows Turkey to project its influence through a number of different means. That can be through international aid, that can be through mediation efforts, that can be through a number of education initiatives, and so on. So there's an economic component to that. The second component is essentially the product of the geopolitical transformation of the region, where after the U.S. intervention in Iraq, we have seen a growing Turkish influence in the region, and that really is the second factor. The third factor is the policy environment, where compared to previous years, where the priority of the Turkish government was to have a good relationship with the West and was to embed Turkey firmly in the Western institutions, and in particular to make Turkey a member of the European Union. Current priorities are somewhat different. The AKP government attaches importance to retain good relations with the West, but nonetheless, this objective now is only an element in the overall Turkish foreign policy, whereas the final objective in this framework is to transform Turkey into a pivotal state that has a widespread influence over the region, almost a benign hegemon. So I think from that perspective, there's also a policy dimension which is different from the past, which explains the growth of Turkish influence. Well, Turkey's influence has definitely increased as a foreign policy actor, most particularly in its own region and in the Middle East. We see that through a number of different initiatives. One are relations with Turkey's southern neighbors, where we see Turkey playing a constructive role in mainstreaming Syria, for instance. Turkish authorities like to claim that they've been influential in helping Syria to engage constructively on a number of areas, be it on the Middle East peace process, but also with regard to negotiations with Israel, and also help the Syrian leadership to engage in dialogue with EU leaders and also the US. Turkey has been quite influential in Lebanon, for instance, where it has helped the creation of a new government. It has developed a number of links throughout the region. The latest example, which has been criticized, obviously, in many, including in Washington, was Turkey's ability to convince Iran, along with Brazil, of course, to sign a series of commitments with regard to its nuclear program. So on the bilateral side, there's been quite a remarkable growth of Turkish influence in the region, which is also reflected on the multilateral side. So Turkey is pursuing a much more active multilateral diplomacy. For the first time since 47 years, Turkey has been elected to the UN Security Council with a very high number of votes, about 150 votes out of 190 countries. So that shows the type of influence that Turkey has been able to project around the world in its bilateral relations. Turkey has also been involved in a number of mediation efforts in the region between Syria and Israel, between Afghanistan and Pakistan, between the different factions in Lebanon, but also in the Balkans. And Turkey has been instrumental in getting a process of rapprochement going between the governments of Bosnia and the Serbian government. And finally, Turkey has become a much more visible actor in terms of humanitarian aid, where today the official aid budget of Turkey is about $1.5 billion, and it gives aid to about 98 different countries around the world. So in many ways, there is a new assertiveness and a new visibility and a growing regional footprint of Turkish diplomacy. In terms of Turkey's influence in the Middle East, what is happening are essentially three things. One, there is a growing, especially after the US intervention in Iraq, there's a growing anti-Americanism in the Middle East, which has led to the loss of legitimacy of the US power in the Middle East. And in a way, Turkey is stepping in to fill that political vacuum. The second dimension there is not only Turkey, but Iran has also, in a way, stepped in this. And there is now a competition between Turkey and Iran about spheres of influence in the Middle East. And Turkish authorities like to argue that the spread of Turkish influence is essentially there to prevent the further spread of Iranian influence. And the third element, of course, is that these are positive trends for Turkish policymakers. But the negative trend that we have seen in the Middle East is whereas Turkey's relations with Israel has, since the 1990s, been quite good, almost as a strategic partnership where Turkey and Israel had a very strong collaboration in the areas of military but also intelligence cooperation. Now, after the Gaza incidents, after the Israeli intervention in Gaza, the Turkish government adopted a very strident anti-Israeli rhetoric, which of course culminated after the flotilla incident where 8 Turkish nationals lost their lives after an Israeli attack. So now Turkey-Israeli relations are in a dismal state. And that means essentially that Turkey has been sidelined from the Middle East peace process, where up until a few years ago it has played and it wanted to play a constructive role, because it was one of the very few countries that could actually talk constructively, both with the Israeli side but also with the Palestinian side. Now Turkey has lost this ability, and from that sense, it has to enter in terms of the balance sheet of the foreign policy influence. It is certainly a disadvantage for Turkey to have been sidelined from the Middle East peace process, because it cannot anymore have a good dialogue with the Israeli authorities. I think it's too simplistic to argue that Turkey is shifting away from the West. The way I see it is that in previous years, Turkey's relationship with the West was of utmost priority. What is happening today is that the relationship with the West has lost its exclusive positioning in the spectrum of Turkish foreign policy. So yes, it is still important, and there are many structural elements which bind Turkey to the West. Turkey is still part of almost all European institutions. The Turkish economy is very interdependent with the European economy. 50% of Turkish exports go to European market. 80% of foreign direct investment come from Europe or the US. There is a large constituency in Turkey that view the Western lifestyle as the main paradigm for the present and future of the country. So there's a number of very important structural elements that militate for Turkey's anchor within the West. But what is happening is that there's a shift in the importance that the Western dimension used to have. Now, that dimension is only part of the whole picture, and the Turkish government is putting more emphasis today on developing a similar web of relationship with the countries around Turkey, and therefore the priority that is attached to having to the relations with the West compared to previous decades has relatively been minimized. And therefore today what we can think, or the way that I would frame this evolution, is not to say that Turkey is shifting away from the West, but there's a reassessment of Turkey's overall relationship, and the Western relationship is losing its prevalence, its exclusivity, and therefore what we're seeing are the repercussions of this reassessment. Turkey's relationship with Europe is unfortunately going through a very difficult period. And it is really, I think, the fault of the European governments at this particular point in time, because Turkey has been one of the longest members of the European family to have had an official relationship with the EU since 1963. And it was only in 2004 that Turkey and the EU decided to open the negotiations for full membership. But after that, a number of structural barriers, like the problem of Cyprus, the fact that the incoming French President Sarkozy has adopted an openly anti-Turkey discourse, have combined to stall the negotiations. So today, for instance, the two sides are to negotiate 33 chapters, and 18 of them are suspended because of political reasons, either because of Cyprus, because of France, a number of other issues. And there are only 3 chapters now that can be opened. So that paints a rather pessimistic backdrop regarding Turkey's accession prospects. And that has had a reflection on how Turkish opinion, public opinion, perceives the EU. Whereas in 2004, when this decision was taken, 74% of the Turkish public supported the EU objective, Turkey's EU membership. Today, that support has dropped to the low 30s. And the fact that there are very few people today in Turkey that believe that this accession will proceed. And this has certainly impacted the way that the government reacts. It has led to a loss of momentum in the reform process, but it has also led to a sort of alienation with Europe, which has had implications for Turkish foreign policy, and which has led to the diversification, in a way, of Turkish foreign policy as well. I would tend to think that today the difficulties that we have been witnessing in Turkey's relationship with Europe have to do, to a large extent, with the fact that Europe is uncertain about how it wants to deal with Turkey. compared to past candidacies where we have seen a number of enlargement happen. The different thing now with regard to Turkey is really the lack of political willingness on the EU side. Had we had that political willingness, things would be very different in Turkey. Reforms would proceed at a faster pace. But now the belief is that no matter what we do back in Turkey, the EU's answer will be the same, will be to say we don't know, will be to procrastinate. And therefore it's really the lack of political willingness, the inability of the EU leaders to tell to Turkey unambiguously that if and when Turkey fulfills the conditions for membership, then that day EU membership will happen. As long as we don't hear that message back in Turkey, it's going to be difficult to rejuvenate this process. So I think here it's really up to the EU to decide, EU leaders, EU member states, to reassess the situation and basically to really also engage with their public opinion, to tell them once more why this relationship with Turkey is important, why it is going to be good both for Turkey and for Europe to have the negotiations proceed, and to one day to see Turkey as a full member of the EU. Unless they do that, and I think here the responsibility lies essentially with the EU leaders, it is going to be difficult to expect that the relationship will suddenly improve. Turkey's relationship with the US is actually a very dynamic and important relationship. What we have seen in the recent past is that in a number of critical areas, which started with the US intervention on Iraq, the two sides have apparently and visibly disagreed. And the disagreement over Iraq generated a sentiment of anti-Americanism in Turkey. But obviously the relationship is much broader than that. And today there are many other areas where the two cooperate, in particular in Afghanistan, but also in Iraq. Now that the US troops are getting ready to move out, Turkey has adopted a much more constructive attitude towards the Iraqi leadership, and is there as a way to ensure the stability of the country after the US troops leave. However, having said that, what we're also witnessing with the changes in Turkish foreign policy and the new assertiveness of Turkish foreign policy is that compared to the years of the Cold War and certainly the years thereafter, the fact that the interests of the US and Turkey can overlap is certainly going to be, or the fact that the interests may not overlap is something that we should get used to. That Turkey's policies in the Middle East, in some cases, and of course Iran comes to mind, the policy toward Israel comes to mind, may not be at odds, may not be in parallel with US policy. And I think on both sides we should get used to this new state of affairs, that Turkey wants to have a larger power space, and the US should be in a position to accommodate Turkey. In return, however, and this is what I have been arguing, in return the US can ask Turkey to upgrade its stance on normative policies. So Turkey should adopt a more normative approach to foreign policy, and in particular become a more responsible and constructive player in areas related to global challenges, global governance like climate change, non-proliferation, trade facilitation, financial regulation. This is where a balance must be struck. The US should be ready to allow Turkey to have its own space in foreign policy, even though that means that some of Turkey's foreign policy actions may not particularly please Washington. But in return, the US should demand Turkey to become a more visible, responsible, constructive actor in areas related to global challenges. The way that Washington views Turkey is changing. The image of Turkey as in a way, docile Western country has radically changed in Washington. The questions that I hear is essentially the Washington establishment is trying to interpret what this new Turkey is about. What the transformation of Turkish foreign policy will mean in the future for US foreign policy. And I think this is still a debate within Washington that has not ended. It's also because the debate has not ended in Turkey. We're also trying to interpret what the implications of the transformation of Turkey and Turkish foreign policy will mean for Turkey's relations with Washington, for Turkey's relations with the EU, and for Turkey's relations with the countries in our neighborhood. So in that sense, the only thing that we can say for certain is that there is a reassessment, and that reassessment has not been concluded yet. For Turkey, when we talk to the Turkish policymakers, the US is the main strategic actor in many areas where Turkey wants to have a growing regional footprint. In that sense, even though the EU might have more impact in terms of the domestic developments regarding the democratization agenda, for instance, on the foreign policy side, it is really the US that has a much more visible impact on the evolution of Turkish foreign policies. The US is the global power, and it is essentially the Turkish interests that may overlap or that may collide with the US interest in the area, in particular in the Middle East, where Turkey wants to become more active. Turkey has been very active with regard to Iran, and that has led to a deal that's been heavily criticized particularly by the US. What I think Turkey wants to do on Iran is, first of all, it wants the international community to recognize that Turkey should be part of the team of solution seekers. That if the international community wants to find a solution to the Iranian problem, that Turkey should be one of the parties that will contribute to that solution. So that is, in essence, what Turkey wants to show to the rest of the world. And I think in that sense, the deal that Turkey had signed along with Brazil, with Iran on the nuclear issue has been quite important by showing that Turks could actually bring the Iranians to the negotiations table. So going forward, two things will happen. One, I think the US and the countries that are leading the negotiations with Iran will adopt a more welcoming attitude to Turkey and would want to use the facilities that Turkey has on offer with its ability to establish channels of communications with the Iranian leadership. But on the Turkish side, Turkish policymakers will also realize that the role that Turkey can play in this is a role essentially of being a facilitator and not a mediator. The difference being that if Turkey remains as a facilitator, the relationship with the Western partners will be much easier to construct and to develop. Whereas as a mediator, Turkey takes on a number of additional risks. And I think the Turkish policymakers now have realized this. And going forward, I would tend to think that both sides have drawn their conclusions from the nuclear deal in May, which has been criticized. And therefore, this new distribution of roles with Turkey not a mediator but a facilitator in the Iranian conflict will essentially be the role that we shall witness in the months and years to come. Turkey does not want a nuclear Iran. That is clear. The way that Turkey has determined a different course of action is not in terms of a different strategic objective. Here, the strategic objective with Turkey's Western partners, and in particular the US, are the one and the same. The two countries don't want to see a nuclear Iran. But Turkey decided to adopt the path of negotiations, of dialogue with the Iranian authorities, believing that this will allow the Iranian regime to change its course of action on the nuclear issue and to become more transparent with regard to the nuclear program. And as a proof, Turkish policymakers show the nuclear fuel swap deal that they had concluded in May of this year with the Iranian leadership. So in terms of the strategic objective, they are the same. In terms of the tactics, there's a difference about how to implement these short-term and long-term goals. But in essence, Turkey does not want a nuclear Iran, given that Turkey would be the country that would fall under the threat of Iranian missiles. But moreover, the risk that Turkish policymakers see is a risk of regional instability and escalation of threats in the region. Not so much a risk towards Turkey, because there is, the people don't, the policymakers don't think that Iran will threaten Turkey. Turkey, at the end of the day, is a country that benefits from the NATO nuclear umbrella. But the risk is to see regional instability with other countries trying to outmaneuver Iran, Iran becoming more aggressive in the pursuit of its foreign policy objectives. And that is definitely something that Turkish policymakers want to prevent because they see it as a threat to regional stability.